IHL can potentially apply to Pakistan. And therefore, since I wrote my thesis on IHL during my LLM, I was assigned to him as a law clerk. I have worked at RSI before as well. I worked here for a year prior to leaving for my master's, and now this is my second year at RSI. I'll be giving you guys a basic understanding of what IHL is, and I'll just be going over the basics, nothing too complicated. And but before I do that, does anybody already know? I'm sure you have got a basic understanding from the video as well. But usse pehle, were you guys aware of what IHL is, what protections it offers, anything?
The rules and regulations for entering into the war, and then the rules and regulations for during the war. So it covers all these things. And then during the war, how to fight in a way that no civilian or dead persons are important.
It tells us what are the things which are permitted in war, and it also tells us what are the things which are not permitted in war. Which weapons cannot be used, which persons cannot be killed. So it actually regulates the war.
बिल्कुल सही, लेकिन there's one thing that needs to be clarified at this point. जैसा आपने कहा ना कि it also tells us when you can go to war. That's different. That's not IHL. That is specified under your UN Charter, and that is your resort to war. That is distinct from IHL. IHL is basically just going to tell you what protections are in place for civilians, for people who are wounded or who are too sick to fight and have given up. Basically, they are not anymore engaged in hostilities, right? Okay. So now you may have seen in movies that when a war is shown, there are two armies, they're facing each other, and one person from the opposite army approaches the other army with a white flag, as you can see on the slide. Now, can anybody tell me what is the significance of this white flag? What does it signify?
Ceasefire.
Ceasefire or
Surrender.
surrender भी हो सकता है, इसके अलावा peace भी हो सकता है, या ये भी हो सकता है कि I am approaching you, I should not be made the subject of an attack, I enjoy immunity, I enjoy protection, and therefore I am just coming to discuss certain matters with you, right? So you can see that these movies that used to show a man approaching with a white flag, they are depicting armies from a very old time. बहुत पुराने वक्तों की ये movies हैं, and so that means that certain limitations were laid down even then. There are certain rules of war were laid down, and so IHL is not something that has sprung up recently. These rules of war have been there since time immemorial. I can make a religious reference as well. For example, Holy Prophet peace be upon him के time में अगर आप देखें तो he had given specific instructions that women and children be spared. What is that? That is humanitarian law. So these laws have been in place for hundreds of years. Now, this is basically all these rules have now evolved into modern international humanitarian law. And this humanitarian spirit, ये जो इन्होंने certain rules lay down किए थे, this has basically led to the first Geneva Convention. I'm sure you all of you have heard of the Geneva Convention, and to the birth of modern humanitarian law. Now, IHL अगर उसको define किया जाए तो what is it? It's a set of rules that for humanitarian reasons seek to limit the effects of armed conflict. It is a body of law that protects persons who are no longer engaged in hostilities. If they have given up arms, they have surrendered, so they should not be made the target of hostilities or made the subject of an attack. Stop me anywhere there is any confusion, कोई बात आप लोगों के दिमाग में any question, just let me know, ठीक है? Now, IHL offers protection to people who are no longer engaged in hostilities, who have laid down their arms. They could either be wounded or sick. Thus, for the protection, IHL is giving protection for people who are most vulnerable in hostilities. And basically, it's setting limitations in warfare. फिर हम आ जाते हैं कि इसके अंदर IHL में सबसे जो एक बेसिक कॉर्नरस्टोन प्रिंसिपल है, what is that? That a distinction at all times must be made between civilians and combatants. Civilians can never be directly targeted. The cornerstone principles of IHL. अच्छा, now before I go on to the next slide, I just want to ask you, आप लोगों ने अभी लेक्चर सुना मेरी कॉलीग का विनाहिल का और इंटरनेशनल ह्यूमन राइट्स लॉ. So what do you guys think कि इंटरनेशनल ह्यूमन राइट्स लॉ और इंटरनेशनल ह्यूमैनिटेरियन लॉ में कोई डिफरेंसेस हैं, कोई सिमिलैरिटीज हैं, कुछ है? आप जी बताएं. बिल्कुल जी. और
War situation of peace and definitely different circumstances हैं. जैसे right to life, वैसे तो सोल्जर को भी एज ए ह्यूमन राइट उसका है जी, लेकिन वो चूंकि एक वॉर सिचुएशन में होगा तो उस पर वो उस तरह से एप्लीकेबल नहीं होगा. अलबत्ता एक नॉन कम्बैटेंट पे वो एक मजीद उस पर इन्फोर्समेंट हो जाएगी कि इंटरनेशनल ह्यूमन राइट्स प्लस ह्यूमैनिटेरियन लॉ यूज.
तो आप do you guys think that armed conflict के अंदर human rights are still applicable or are they not?
Yes, they are.
They are. But can yes.
And humanitarian law is not applicable at the peace time. But
Okay. So basically आपका जो international human rights law है that's applicable throughout peacetime and conflict, but it may be derogated from during the time of an armed conflict. Certain limitations can be placed on the rights that are given during armed conflict. ठीक है? IHL जी.
I think कुछ qualified laws, qualified rights पढ़े थे.
बिल्कुल.
Perhaps
Derogation हो
they,
जाता.
हाँ,
जी
so
जी बिल्कुल.
the absolute rights remain same throughout,
Right.
and the qualified rights, they perhaps.
Rights that can be derogated.
Exactly.
Precisely, that is the concept. And IHL का भी ठीक है. It is primarily made for an armed conflict paradigm. However, there are certain obligations that are still in place even in peacetime. For example, the obligation upon a state to disseminate information on IHL, the importance of IHL. So such things remain in place even during peacetime. Lekin yes, it's primarily applicable during an armed conflict. Now, international humanitarian law and international human rights law are two complementary bodies of public international law, which governs relations between subjects capable of possessing international rights and duties. IHL applies in situations of armed conflict, as we just discussed, and has been specifically conceived to regulate such situations. IHRL generally applies at all times, including during armed conflict and after in peacetime as well. Now, international humanitarian law, known as the law of armed conflict, is a set of rules designed to limit the effects of armed conflict. It protects persons who are not basically engaged in active hostilities anymore, and it restricts the means and methods of warfare. Now, human rights are rights inherent to all human beings. IHRL is basically laying down obligations on states. And IHL, on the other hand, is laying down obligations on states and the non-state armed forces that are participating in active hostility. So a clear distinction can be made in this regard. अब ये देखें कि IHL is addressing both non-state armed groups and the state, right? But IHRL is laying down obligations specifically on the state to protect the human rights of its citizens and to refrain from certain actions so as not to infringe upon their human rights. So IHL only applies during an armed conflict and does not allow for derogations, as opposed to IHRL, which allows for certain derogations to be made, and IHRL applies to state parties, whereas IHL binds all parties to a conflict, including non-state parties, as I just mentioned. Now, before I move on to the next slide, does anybody know the difference or what jus ad bellum and jus ad bello is?
Jus ad bellum means that why a war should be stopped. Justifying a war.
Exactly.
And jus ad bellum means how the war should be conducted.
Exactly. And jus ad bello is synonymous with IHL because that's laying down limitations upon how a war can be fought, and jus ad bellum is the resort to war. So again, जो हमने शुरू में बात की थी that these are two distinct things, तो वो आप इसमें आप देखेंगे कि jus ad bellum is different from jus ad bello. Jus ad bellum जो है आपका, उसमें क्या concept आ जाता है? उसमें ये आता है कि jus ad bellum refers to the conditions under which states may resort to war or to the use of armed force in general. The prohibition against the use of force among states and the exceptions to it, self-defense and UN authorization for the use of force set out in the UN Charter of 1945 are the core ingredients of jus ad bellum. Some people confuse jus ad bellum with IHL. That is not the case. Okay? So I hope this is clear in your minds. Jus in bello, on the other hand, regulates the conduct of parties engaged in armed conflict. IHL is synonymous with jus in bello. It seeks to minimize suffering in armed conflicts, notably by protecting and assisting all victims of armed conflict to the greatest extent possible. ठीक है? तो ये आप लोगों को समझ आया कि jus ad bellum is the resort to war and jus in bello is laying down certain restrictions on how war can be fought and is synonymous with IHL.
So jus ad bellum would be how, for example, let's take the example of US invading Iraq. So jus ad bellum would deal with if whether the invasion of Iraq is justified or not, whereas jus in bello would be whether the UN, whatever the US troops did in Iraq was justified or not. Like their activities, like for example, एक काफी मशहूर वीडियो है जिसके ऊपर उनका the chopper that killed a lot of Reuters के दो journalists भी मारे थे उन्होंने, तो that would be jus in bello, and fact that whether US entered Iraq was right or not, that would be jus ad bellum.
बिल्कुल, that's excellent. जिस तरह वो एक और famous example था where they accidentally targeted a school and a lot of children died as a result of it. They thought that some high-profile leader was there, but in fact it was just a school of children. And so that was a violation of IHL. Whereas if the war overall is justified or not is discussed under jus ad bellum. Now we move on to the sources of IHL. Now, just like any other body of international law, IHL can be found in three distinct sources: treaties, customs, and the general principles of law. In addition, case law, doctrine, and in practice, soft law plays an increasingly important role in the interpretation of individual rules of IHL. Now, ये बाकी बातें treaties, customs वगैरह आप लोगों ने पहले international law वाले lecture में काफी detail में discuss किया होगा, so I'm just going to skip directly to treaty law. Does anybody know which treaties codify principles of IHL? Additional protocols, बिल्कुल, और ये का भी conventions भी हैं. So now today IHL is one of the most densely codified branches of international law. In practice, therefore, the most relevant sources of IHL are treaties applicable to the armed conflict in question. Moving chronologically, the Geneva Convention of 1864 came first, and that kind of laid down the basic rules of how to protect the wounded in armies in the field. So this was the first kind of codification of these principles. 1864 में आपकी पहली आई Geneva Convention. Then it basically established rules for the care and treatment of the wounded. Now this treaty was spurred on by the horrors of the Crimean War, which mandated humane treatment of the wounded, established protection for medical personnel, and sanctified the symbol of the Red Cross. तो उसने एक basic एक framework आपके लिए lay down कर दिया that these are the rules that you have to follow when fighting a war. Then came the Hague Convention जो आपके 1899 और 1907 के हैं. These are considered some of the first formal statements of the laws of war and war crimes in the body of secular international law. Now, the first convention in 1899 established rules of war that included prohibitions against. उन्होंने specify कर दिया कि these things are prohibited in the 1899 Hague Convention: the use of poisons, the killing of enemy combatants who have surrendered, the looting of a town's of property by occupying forces, and the attack or bombardment of undefended towns. ठीक है? Then World War I broke out, and as you all know, all hell broke loose. Now, all the treaties that had been established up until 1914 had little effect on the brutality of the conflict. The Hague Convention was violated. मैं आपको इसका example देती हूँ. The German invasion of Belgium was a violation of the Hague Convention of 1907, which states that hostilities must not commence without prior warning, without explicit warning. So obviously there was no such prior warning. So that was a clear violation. Then poison gas was also used.
That prior warning is a declaration of formal declaration of war.
Exactly. And nowadays you know that such things are not really commonplace. There is no such formal declaration of initiating war, right? So even back then it was violated, and poison gas was used against enemy soldiers by all major belligerents throughout the war in violation of the Hague Convention 1899. So clearly, जो protections laid down की गई थी, they were not sufficient by themselves. So more needed to be done. Now, clearly, despite being passed and ratified, the Hague Conventions failed in maintaining order and civility during wartime. Now, following World War I, the Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for the prisoners of war. Exactly. ठीक है? So 1929 में they realized that certain rules, certain protections have to be laid down to protect the prisoners of war. They have to be treated humanely. They have to be treated in a certain dignified manner. Now, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 are the last major international treaty to deal with laws of war, treatment of prisoners and civilians, as well as the rights and responsibilities of occupying powers. Since 1949, आपके 3 additional protocols आ चुके हैं. Additional protocol 1 जो था, that deals with international armed conflict, right? And आपका additional protocol 2 deals with non-international armed conflict.
How does IHL address internationalized armed conflict?
That's something we'll be coming to. There's a whole dedicated. फिर हम आ जाते हैं. There are also weapons treaties such as the 1980 Convention on certain conventional weapons or the 2008 Convention on cluster munitions, and there are detailed rules laid down that certain weapons are prohibited, why they are prohibited, and for example, exploding bullets, any weapon that basically causes unnecessary or superfluous harm to a person or a combatant is basically prohibited under IHL. It should not cause unnecessary suffering to a combatant. ठीक है? So ये सारी जो आपकी treaties हैं, they are laying down your basic principles of IHL and they are codified under these treaties. जी.
Perhaps this is a late question, but can you please define what the jus ad bellum and jus in bello, what those words mean?
Jus in bellum is basically the resort to war, and jus in bello is your protections under IHL. That is the.
Jus in bello means?
Jus in bello is the protections laid down under IHL, and jus ad bellum is basically your resort to war.
Alright. This is Latin, I think.
This is Latin. Then we move on to Hague Conventions. Hague Conventions आपकी ये है 18G.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard this concept that the Geneva Conventions are based on the customary practices of customary international law.
Customary international law is something that is also distinct from Geneva Conventions, but yes, it does codify customary law to a large extent.
So right now, IHL is based on these two laws, and it's not other than.
It is also based on custom. I said that there are 3 primary sources. उसमें custom भी है.
मतलब कोई ऐसा custom है?
Custom exactly मैं आपको बता देती हूँ. जैसा custom में आपकी बातें आ जाती हैं, reciprocity का principle आ जाता है. आपका ये आ जाता है कि civilians cannot be targeted. These are all things that have become a part of state practice and have been going on for many years, and therefore they have been codified into customary international law and also acts as a source of IHL.
My point is कि जितने भी customary practices IHL से related थे, already अब treaty में आ चुके हैं.
हाँ.
तो इस वक्त अभी treaty से बाहर कोई ऐसा customary
हो सकती है, जिसका कॉमन आर्टिकल 3 जो है आपका, ठीक है. Sometimes ये भी concept होता है आपका that certain things, even if a treaty has not been ratified as such by a state, then if it constitutes customary law, then it's irrelevant, right? So it's kind of operating outside the ambit of the treaty, right? So it's not one and the same thing always. अच्छा, फिर Hague Conventions आपकी आ जाती है. The Hague Conventions respecting the laws and customs of war on land and the adaptation to maritime warfare of the principles of the 1864 Geneva Convention and the 1907 review of the Hague Conventions of 1899 and adoption of new conventions. ठीक है, तो ये आपकी Hague Conventions है. फिर हम आ जाते हैं Geneva Conventions में. I'm sure you're all aware of the Geneva Convention. Therefore, wounded and sick in armed forces for land and wounded and sick and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea treatment of prisoners of war and protection of civilians in times of war. तो ये आपकी 4 basic Geneva Conventions हैं, ठीक है? Now you may be wondering what's the difference between Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions. Now just to give you a very simplified version of that, is that under the Geneva Conventions they pointed out the categories of protected people. कि Geneva Convention laid down that these categories of people are protected and these are your basic prohibitions जो थी आपकी Hague Conventions में laid down की गई थी. So this is kind of a basic comparison of the two. फिर हम आ जाते हैं IHL की basic principles पे. Now what are the basic core most fundamental principles of IHL? Number 1, a distinction must always be maintained between civilians and combatants. Civilians can never be directly targeted. ठीक है? फिर number 2 आपका आ जाता है that anybody who is not engaged in hostilities cannot be targeted. Either they are wounded or they are sick, they have given up their arms, surrendered. So इसका वो कहते हैं hors de combat and the prohibition to attack those that are hors de combat. फिर आपकी third आ जाता है basic principle, which is that IHL restricts means and methods of warfare that inflict unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to combatants. Something that I just discussed, कि certain types of weapons are prohibited. For example, exploding bullets which cause unnecessary suffering to combatants, they have been prohibited by IHL. So this is another fundamental principle of IHL. Then IHL further dictates that a balance has to be drawn between military necessity on one hand and humanity on the other. This is something that we'll discuss. Each individual principle we'll be discussing in more depth. Lastly, there is the principle of proportionality. अच्छा, now distinction का we'll be discussing the principle of distinction first. Now the principle of distinction, as discussed previously, is the cornerstone of IHL. It is based on the recognition that the only legitimate object the state should endeavor to accomplish during war is to weaken the military forces of the enemy, whereas the civilian population and individual civilians shall enjoy general protection against dangers arising from military operations. तो आपने enemy की forces को target करना है. You cannot target civilians or civilian objects. Therefore, the parties to an armed conflict must at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall direct their operations only against military objectives. Military objectives क्या होते हैं, आप लोगों को क्या लगता है?
For example, forces or support infrastructure.
Exactly, anything that makes their tactical operation useful or facilitates their tactical operation, right? So that can be a military objective.
Capturing certain posts, getting advantage of a certain
लेकिन
bridge.
जो सिविलियन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर जैसे ब्रिजेस हैं या रेल रोड्स हैं जो दोनों साइड पर वो भी प्रोहिबिटेड है.
हाँ, but provided there is one exception, अगर एक civilian object is being used as a military objective, then they may be targeted, provided that आपकी बाकी जो proportionality का concept जो है आप उसको balance कर रहे हो, military necessity with humanity आप balance कर रहे हो, then they may be targeted. Yes?
And is this the clause that the Russians use to justify how they target hospitals in Syria?
I'm not entirely sure that they use this justification for it, but because see, you cannot possibly say that there is any justification to target hospitals, right?
Right.
They're protected under IHL under all costs.
But what if, like, for example, would you say, like I saw like the white flag thing. Of course, nowadays it's not very like that's not how it goes on the running field, because like you have wireless communication and all. But let's assume that there's a position where wireless communication is not working, and a person like an armed person in uniform has to go over to the other side, and if he's like he has a white flag, but let's assume he's wearing a suicide jacket, and he goes over there and he's trying to like exploit the other party.
That's called perfidy. That's forbidden under IHL.
Right, but I mean in war, for example, I mean if
So that
how
by
does that?
itself is a violation of IHL. Perfidy is to basically fool the other party into believing that you're approaching them to discuss matters or something else and you attack them. So that is the exact definition of perfidy.
सही, तो उसके लिए फिर the other
That's
parties are
forbidden.
justified to like,
Exactly.
सही.
देखिए ना, IHL का कॉन्सेप्ट ही रेसिप्रोसिटी पे बेस्ड है. What is reciprocity? Does anybody know?
Tit for tat.
Exactly. So if the other party, state B, is not respecting IHL, state A will have the authority to retaliate. It's based on reciprocity.
So, for example, if during World War II, if the Allied forces had prisoner of wars from the other side and the Axis
And they
had,
tortured them.
again, if Axis were torturing Allied, so Allied के लिए torture करना justify हो जाता है?
Exactly. Then it's
That's
not.
allowed for them?
That's not a violation of IHL. IHL is based on reciprocity. So if you have to ensure reciprocity between states, and that is the only way compliance of IHL can be fulfilled. So if state A is violating IHL, then it's not a war crime then to do this. Get it? So there's a
So that's
distinction.
actually pretty interesting.
Is that basically
Principle
accountable
of
to each other that means?
No.
They're not accountable to
ICC का war crime तो obviously something else, but I'm saying they have to. लेकिन दो distinct आपके concepts हैं. ICRC का जो concept है of reciprocity, that is that even if you are if state B violates IHL, you still have to enforce IHL. This is ICRC rule. ठीक है?
ICRC
But
stands for what? please?
International Committee of the Red Cross. ठीक है?
Okay.
Right? This is their understanding of it, and they are basically the organization that promotes IHL and ensures compliance with it, right? So that's their understanding of it. But under IHL, under international law, it is based on reciprocity, and so if state A does something, then state B also has the authority to do something.
For
For
However,
example, if state A is attacking the civilians and innocent people,
Reci-
state B has the right to kill their citizens.
exactly, it's war then, right? But
So what's the use of IHL then? Come
the
on.
IHL, I'm saying violations of IHL can still be punished at a much higher forum, which is called the International Criminal Court. We'll be coming to that, and we'll also be discussing the concept of reciprocity in more detail अभी आगे, ठीक है? अच्छा, फिर we move on to the basic rule of distinction requires that the parties to an armed conflict distinguish at all times between civilian persons and civilian objects on one hand and combatants and military objectives on the other. A party to an armed conflict may direct an attack only against combatants or military objectives, as we just said. Now, all members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict are combatants. So, सारे जो members हैं armed forces के, they are combatants except medical and religious person. ठीक है? When civilian objects are used for military purposes, जो आप जिस तरह पूछे थे या आप भी पूछ रहे थे, कि when civilian objects are used for military purposes, example a civilian train that is used to transport weapons and combatants, they may become military objectives, right? And so then it's lawful to attack if they fulfill the above mentioned definitions.
I'm very sorry, but like for example, if that train, I mean, it could be a military strategy to fill that train up with civilians and then have one like car full of like
Exactly.
munitions and like soldiers.
That's just what the rule is.
Collateral damage?
Yeah.
All right.
जी? Human shields.
So about the civilian casualties during the airstrikes, recent days in Syria, what's happening? So does it count in the collateral damage?
Definitely. It is collateral damage. War is a nasty business. There is no other way to put it.
मैं सिग्नेटरीज होते हैं जिन्हें कि जैसे आप मिलिटेंट ग्रुप्स हैं दे आर नॉट सिग्नेटरीज टू दैट, तो उनसे फिर अप्लाई नहीं करता है ये
IHL applies to non-state armed groups as well. Most likely उन्होंने तो ratify नहीं किया होगा, कुछ नहीं किया होगा. So वो discussion आपकी आती है in non-international conflict, which is something we will be discussing. Then under the principle of distinction comes the principle of precaution. Precaution क्या है? कि you have to minimize the infliction of incidental death, जिसका collateral damage की आप बात करें ना, तो this comes under precaution as well. You have to minimize the infliction of incidental death, injury, and destruction on persons and objects protected against direct attack. Accordingly, IHL requires that in the conduct of military operations, constant care shall be taken to spare the civilian population, civilians and civilian objects. Now this applies both to the attacking party, which must do everything feasible to avoid inflicting incidental harm as a result of its operations, precautions and attack, and to the party being attacked, which to the maximum extent feasible must take all necessary measures to protect the civilian population under its control from the effects of attacks carried out by the enemy. तो यानी they have to make sure कि उसका incidental damage जो है it does not exceed the military advantage of the attack.
Right? Who's going to decide that during the war?
Basically अगर आप पहली इराक वॉर का एग्जांपल लेते हैं, ठीक है, तो उसमें every time a missile was fired there was one lawyer attached to it who would vet whether the legality of that attack. Right? I'm not saying it happens in every attack. Drones have killed so many people. So these are clear violations of IHL. I'm not saying that each and everything is being implemented, but that is our job here to ensure the protection of civilians during war and to promote the principles of IHL so that there is awareness. Exactly.
Right.
ताकि even armies जो हैं, they are aware that these are the basic principles that they have to protect. We have developed, मैं आप लोगों को अभी end of the presentation में दिखाऊंगी, we have developed a manual for the Pakistan armed forces, and we have kind of laid down that these are the principles of IHL and these should be protected. They need to know their war manuals based on IHL, so obviously it's somebody's job to educate
part of their training.
Exactly, it is to a certain extent, but sometimes the provisions are kind of ambiguous and they have to be built upon, and that's why we produced a legal reference guide for the Pakistan Armed Forces to tell them about the key legal challenges that are faced during counter-terrorism operations. Okay, I'll show it in class. Now we move on to the next principle, which is to the prohibition to attack all those people who are not engaged in hostilities. One of the most fundamental rules of IHL is that all persons who have fallen into the power of the enemy are entitled to humane treatment regardless of their status and previous function or activities. Accordingly, Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, which is considered to reflect customary minimum yardstick for protection that is binding in any armed conflict, states, ये Common Article 3 है to the Geneva Conventions, and that basically states persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms and those placed hors de combat by sickness, wounds, detention or any other cause, shall in all circumstances be treated humanely without any adverse distinction founded on race, color, religion or faith, sex, birth or wealth or any other similar criteria. So these are basic protections that have been laid down under Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, and it's irrelevant then whether or not a fighter has combatant status or not, they will be given these protections. This is the basic protection that they have. Now, although IHL expressly permits parties to the conflict to take such measures of control and security in regard to persons under their control as may be necessary as a result of the war, the entitlement to humane treatment is absolute. So, ऐसा नहीं है that a person who has not been given a prisoner of war status can be treated inhumanely or that he can be tortured. They have to be treated with dignity and humanity. That is the basic protection that they have at all costs, and that cannot be derogated from.
Usually there is a difference between, so what about espionage?
Espionage is different. We are talking about, लेकिन espionage वाले में भी आपका वो prisoner of war status तो नहीं उसको मिलेगा ना, right? So that's different. So, however, these are the basic standards that will be applied regardless of any other distinction, right? So, you cannot derogate from these even under in that scenario.
Ma'am, the non-combatants or civilians, they take up arms to resist the enemy army.
Sorry,
if non-combatants or civilians, they take up arms to help their army against the enemy army, are they entitled to protection?
As long as they are not actively engaged in hostilities, they are not combatants. As soon as they pick up arms, they become combatants and are
part of the regular army. Still,
they have picked up arms. They are fighting.
There is not a difference between a citizen who is taking up the arm and a trained combatant. What if one is taking up the arm just for his self-defense?
That's irrelevant because you have taken up arms and you're violating IHL. You're not following these principles, and so you're no longer civilian. Then you've taken up arms, so you lose your civilian status. You lose that protection. You become a combatant.
Coming into my house and I'm alone, and if I
That's self-defense. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying she was saying that if you join the forces, that's different.
No, the situation I'm mentioning, this is a war situation. And the person is entering into the army, he's alone. And if I take a कुछ pistol है, कुछ भी ले लो, and if I
That's self-defense. That's different. That's different.
Even if it's happening during the war.
It's in your house. You're defending yourself. You have every time. That's it. Okay. So then we move on to the next principle, which is prohibition to inflict unnecessary suffering. Now, IHL not only protects civilians from the effects of hostilities, it also prohibits or restricts means and methods of warfare that are considered to inflict unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury on combatants. Right? As early as 1868, the St. Petersburg Declaration recognized that the only legitimate object during war is to weaken the military forces of the enemy, that for this purpose it is sufficient to disable the greatest possible number of men, that this object would be exceeded by the employment of arms which uselessly aggravate the sufferings of disabled men or render their death inevitable. So आपको maim करना is not allowed, handicap करना is not allowed, you cannot cause unnecessary suffering. That the employment of such arms would therefore be contrary to the laws of humanity. Accordingly, in the conduct of hostilities, it is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles and material and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Then we move on to the principle of military necessity. Now, IHL is based on a balance between military necessity and humanity. On the one hand, it recognizes that in order to become an adversary in wartime, it may be militarily necessary to cause death, injury and destruction. So, IHL does recognize that you have to use lethal force. IHL is recognizing all of that. However, it's making a clear distinction and it's saying that you have to draw a balance between military necessity and humanity. अब humanity में क्या बात आती है आपकी? That humanity is basically imposing certain limits on the means and methods of warfare and requires that those who have fallen into enemy hands be treated humanely at all times.
So, the chemical warfare, biological warfare, so they are part of IHL, right?
Treaties जो आपकी जो treaties हैं on weapons they deal with.
Right.
Okay, then we move on to the principle of proportionality. Now, where the infliction of incidental harm on civilians or civilian objects cannot be avoided, so where civilian objects का attack जो है cannot be avoided, it is subject to the principle of proportionality as I was mentioning. Accordingly, those who plan or decide an attack must refrain from launching or must suspend any attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So it cannot exceed the military advantage that you are hoping to gain from an attack. Okay? So that is how you balance humanity and military necessity. Now there are two types of conflicts which are recognized by IHL. किसी को पता है? ठीक है, so now we discuss those.
Ma'am, can you please repeat that? Because we are not lawyers.
Okay, sorry. Stop me wherever. Okay, so there are two types of conflicts that are recognized by international humanitarian law. The first one is an international armed conflict, ठीक है, जो आपके साइड पे है, and then there is the non-international conflict, right? So these are the two types that are recognized by IHL. Now we will first discuss an international armed conflict. International armed conflict exists wherever there is recourse to armed force between two or more states. So this is between states. That's why you can guess from the name itself that it's an international armed conflict and therefore it's between states. Now the threshold for determining the existence of an international armed conflict is fairly low. So it can even be a skirmish between the armies, that one soldier gets killed across the border. The threshold of violence is not very high for the existence of an international armed conflict. Also, it does not necessarily have to be an attack against the army of the other state. It can even be an attack, an occupation of the territory, or an attack on the civilian population directly. So it need not be against the armed forces of the opposing state itself.
For example, India and Pakistan.
Now, the attacking state's resort to force need not actually be directed against the armed forces of another state, as I just mentioned. IACs are fought between states. The government is only one of the constitutive elements of a state, while the territory and the population are others. So even if it's something targeting one of these, it can qualify as an international armed conflict. Now, it is the resort to force against the territory, infrastructure, or persons in the state that determines the existence of an IAC and therefore triggers the applicability of IHS. Now, an international armed conflict is governed by the Geneva Conventions. ठीक है, तो ये आपका एक different treaties हैं which govern, different laws which govern international armed conflict and NIACs. So your international armed conflict is governed by the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1. Whereas the non-international armed conflict is governed by Common Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 2. Exactly. ठीक है? So Article number 1 subsection 4 जो आपकी slide पे भी दिया है, Protocol 1 additional to the Geneva Convention states that the situations referred to in the preceding paragraph include armed conflict, is kind of defining what an international armed conflict is, in which peoples are fighting against colonial domination and alien occupation and against racist regimes in the exercise of their right of self-determination as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. So international conflict का आप लोगों को समझ में आया कि basically it's governed by Geneva Conventions, ठीक है, and Additional Protocol, ठीक है, and it's fought between two or more states. It can even be in the form of occupation. The threshold of violence that is needed to establish the existence of an international armed conflict is not very high. Okay, so these are your basic principles of an international armed conflict. Now, on the other hand, a non-international armed conflict is an armed conflict in which hostilities are taking place between the armed forces of a state, yani internally are taking place between the armed forces of a state and organized non-state armed groups. So it can be the army against a non-state armed group or between non-state armed groups themselves. So non-international armed group में armed conflict में basically it's a conflict between the armed forces of the state and non-state armed groups or between non-state armed groups themselves. Now, for hostilities to be considered an NIAC, they must reach a certain level of intensity and the groups involved must be sufficiently organized. So, the threshold of violence needed to establish a non-international armed conflict is higher than an international armed conflict. You have to prove two things for a non-international armed conflict to exist. Number one, that there is a minimum level of intensity of the conflict, and number two, that there is a certain level of organization of the armed groups, and then and only then can the conflict be classified as a non-international armed conflict.
What do you mean by organization?
Organization is that they have a certain hierarchy in place, a certain level of command structure, all of that. So basically saying that, let's take Taliban for example. So do they have the requisite command authority in place or are they split into many small splinter groups? Do they have one unified structure or not? So that is what I mean by saying that they have to have a minimum level of organization.
So what are the status of these organizations in international law? For example, the status of these organizations, for example, Taliban and PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Hamas. these organizations? What are the status of these
Status is that they
organizations?
are recognized internationally as terrorist organizations.
ILO, Hamas. So how international law recognize these organizations? For example, in what criteria, for example, international? How the international law recognize these organizations if they're not state group or not? They are organized group. They are recognized by international law. What are the criteria of it?
Okay, well, I think you might be confusing two things. The international law per se or countries overall in the Committee of Nations are not recognizing organizations as terrorists based on these criteria. The criteria is different, and the criteria may be the level, the number of attacks that they've taken responsibility for, how many attacks they've been responsible for. They have a public profile, so it's not really hard to classify a certain organization as a terrorist organization internationally, right? So that classification is different, but for the purposes of whether a non-international armed conflict exists, you have to see whether the non-state armed group has a certain level of organization or not, right? It's different for classifying terrorist organizations internationally, right?
So, any such group which does not take its sanctity from a state is for a non-state group.
Authority from
Whether it's a terrorist group or not, this is further question, but it is a non-state group. For example, ELF, Islam Immigration Group. This is.
If it is not authorized by the state, does not fall under the sovereign authority of the state, then it is something distinct from the state.
Okay, I have a question regarding that. Because the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was recognized by 2 states. So what happens in that scenario?
What do you mean recognized?
Was Pakistan recognized it as a legitimate government, right?
That's different. Okay, so आपका जो NIACs का concept है, let's say conflict in Fata Fata.
Okay.
So Taliban का you can actually argue that TTP Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. That's different. I'm not talking about that Taliban. I'm talking about Tehreek-e-Taliban.
And what of course are like Zarb Azab and Rahiras, these would be examples of NIAC, right?
They can be.
They can be or they are?
It can be classified as an NIAC.
Or otherwise.
Otherwise, they would be.
Otherwise, if it does not qualify, no. If it does not qualify as a non-international armed conflict, international armed conflict, it can only be a non-international armed conflict, and therefore it has to meet these 2 criteria, sir. Minimum level. In fact, my thesis was on this: whether or not the conflict in Fata Fata qualifies as a non-international armed conflict. And I argued that it does.
And what
About the threshold of violence, right? You said that in international armed conflict the threshold is lower and the other one is higher. So what is the limit? How do you know?
Okay, so
It's very vague in that sense because
let me just explain it to you. In an international armed conflict, I explained that the level of violence, the threshold for it is low in the sense that, for example, if fighting takes place across the border and a soldier dies, that by itself can qualify as an international armed conflict. So the threshold of violence is very low. However, in a non-international armed conflict which is present within the territory of a state, let's say, and non-state armed groups are fighting the state, you have to prove that the level of violence is high and it does not qualify as a mere internal disturbance or tension, right? So it has to be distinct from that, and then only will the principles of IHL become applicable, once this threshold is surpassed.
Violence in terms of civilian killings.
Civilian killings भी हो सकती हैं, it could be suicide bombings, organized suicide bombings, anything like that.
when the incident of ATS happened, that comes in the higher threshold, of course.
Yes, that is why we argue that it qualifies as an NIAC.
But since it was in a chain of events, that's why it will count. For example,
not one off.
like in US,
it
like
has to be
Connecticut,
continuous.
in Connecticut in the US, there was a school shooting. It was very bad, but that would of course not qualify as an NIAC.
It cannot be an isolated incident.
Right.
It has to be a part of the chain.
Now,
How did you prove that non-international armed conflict
Exists?
in Pakistan?
Well, I could only argue in my thesis, but I basically argued it on the basis that they do have a certain level of organization. Uska, of course, the material is freely available. They have the commander in chief. then followed by this person, this person, this person. So they have a proper hierarchy in place. They have operations based in different cities, and so it's not just
They accept as well and they tax it carry out.
exactly. They accept responsibility for it. So
They have a spokesperson.
exactly. So they have a very well established organization. So you cannot argue that an NIAC. That's why my finding was that an NIAC does exist. Yes.
Alright, I have another question. It's kind of curveball, so I'm sorry for that. Syria.
Right.
So we have ISIS over there. ISIS is a recognized terrorist organization, which is not only working in it's not in a single state, it's in multiple states right now. So now ISIS is in Syria. Syria claims to be it has its own 3 countries are basically working over there right now. Actually more than 3. But Russia is recognizing Assad's government as a legitimate government, whereas US and Europeans are not. And then there's a Nusra Front in there, the Free Syrian Army in there, there's ISIS in there. So, what kind of a conflict would that be?
Well, if you confine it to the territory of Syria in itself, then it can qualify as an NIAC. However, if it's engaged across borders, across 2 states, then it's an international conflict. There's no confusion.
But in Syria, the US and the Western allies, they are attacking the Syrian Arab army, that is the army of the regime. So in that case,
exactly, that is what I'm saying. If it's more than 1 state, then it qualifies as an international.
Does it qualify as?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I'm just explaining the scenario to you people. I'll just come to you in a second. That if it's 2 states are engaged in force against each other, then basically it's an international armed conflict. Of Syria ke case mein, if like you said, then it will qualify as an international conflict. Okay?
Does it qualify as internationalized armed conflict, like also known as international, non-international armed conflict, or internationalized civil war, which is
International armed
not
conflict.
recognized by IHL, SKF, but it's still a very hot debate.
I think you're referring to an NIAC.
I'm referring to INIAC.
INIAC. Well, that's a separate concept, but basically, जो आपके